Hello, today we're going to talk about heritability, and I think it's kind of a misunderstood concept a little bit. So I'm going to show you a graphic today that I think really helps, and then I should take you through to the end of this unit. This will be the last video. So when we talk about heritability, we're talking about variation within a group. Some people are taller, some people are shorter, but in this in these brackets here is something really important in these parentheses, raised under the same conditions that can be attributed to genetic differences. So if we say a heritability of 1.0 indicates that everything is genetic, and a heritability of 0 indicates that none of it is genetic. And we're going to look at this in a minute. But nothing is 1. We're not going to say any particular trait is completely passed on through genes, and we're not going to say anything is 0, that genes have nothing to do with it. So when we talk about nature versus nurture, it is definitely both. And we've talked about this before, but let's talk about it in relation to intelligence. So this is a while ago, but review and behavior genetics, and basically what they did is they looked at a whole bunch. Go ahead and pause it too if you want to read this. But they looked at a whole bunch of studies, and what they found was that when they looked at heritability, they found numbers as high as zero point 0.8, and the lowest they saw was 0.4. That is very heritable. What they find is that your intelligence is very heritable from your parents. Now, that's not to say 40% of your intelligence comes from your genes. That's just to say that there is a correlation of about 0.4 between your intelligence and your parents' intelligence, as far as up to 0.8. And we talked about correlation in Unit 2. That is a big correlation in psychology. And then King's College, 20 years later, did a study, and they basically said it was about 0.62. 0.62 was the heritability. So intelligence is really heritable. But there's still, worst case scenario here, it's about zero point 0.4 is not related to that. So let's take a look at what we mean by heritability. This is, and I think we've looked at this slide before, but I just think it's so important to understand. So notice there is a difference within this pot. They have the same lighting, they have the same nutrition. So the heritability is the difference between these. The only difference between all of these plants in this pot is their genes. So we can say the difference here is complete heritability. Same here. Within this pot, it has the same lighting and it has deficient nutrition. So the differences here are related to genes. So we can compare plants within the pot. We cannot compare plants between pots. That is the biggest issue when it comes to intelligence. People will say this particular group is not as intelligent as that other particular group. Well, they weren't raised in the same pot. You go to Lewis and Clark High School, you're lucky. Your pot is rich, it has rich soil, has rich sunlight, and so you are getting really the best nutrition you can get, I think, in among a lot of high schools. If you go to a really rough high school, say in some place that doesn't fund their education very well in some other city, you might be in a pot like this. I just read something interesting that the University of Texas decided that they were going to make automatic admission for any student who is in the top 10% of their class. And I thought that's really interesting. Why? Because you might have a really great plant in here that is in the top 10% of plants, but we don't know how high it can grow because it has bad lighting and bad soil. If we put them in good soil, they might be over here. We cannot compare a kid at a very poorly funded school with kids here. We just can't. We can compare students at Lewis and Clark, but even then, the soil could be the economics, the soil could be the parenting, it could be a whole bunch of different things. So when we want to look at heritability, we want to keep everything equal and say, if all of these students were raised in exactly the same way and had the same education, what is the difference? And the difference among those people, if they are raised in the exact same way, as much as we can do that, that is heritability, the heritability number. So I hope that makes sense. If not, rewind it and try it again. Okay, so this is the big one. There's a book that came out, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago called The Bell Curve, which basically said African Americans were genetically inferior in intelligence. And there are a lot of reasons that that's just not true. So we're going to kind of talk about that, about how we can't compare different pots. Because in this country, you can't say that African Americans since the Civil War, or really ever, have been in the same pot as other groups. So we're going to look at that. So when we compare groups, we do testing. And I'm going to talk about, we need to keep it confidential, but this is the big one I want to talk about, the stereotype threat. There's a video that I can't show on here because the videos don't actually go through. We can't hear the sound. But the video basically said that um, they would give people a test, and they would say there would be a group of Caucasians and a group of African Americans, and they would say, this is a test of strategic thinking in sports. And then the Caucasians would do better on the test. And they would take another group and they'd say, this is a test of athletic ability, and the African Americans would do better on the test. Is it because, well, now why the difference? It's because we invoked the stereotype. The stereotype is that Caucasians are better at analytic thinking and that African Americans are better at athletic type thinking. That's just not true. But you can see that if the test can be gamed by me telling you what it measures, and there are different outcomes depending on what I tell you it measures, there's a problem with the test. And so when we measure things, if there's any stereotype, if we say girls are better at this or boys are better at this, if we say girls are better, girls will score better. If we say boys are better, boys will score better. So if we invoke a stereotype, students, for the most part, will adhere to that stereotype, and the test results will adhere to that stereotype. So what does that say about testing? It says that there are other things other than intelligence that go into your score. So it's really hard to measure intelligence in that way. And there's also implicit cultural bias. This is one of my favorites. This is an old SAT test, and this was what they called an analogy. And they would say a runner is to a marathon as these are. So a runner runs in a marathon, and you look at these questions and you say, and maybe you pause it and say, which one is it? Well, here's the problem. The answer is C. A runner participates in a marathon, an oarsman participates in a regatta. I'll bet a lot of you didn't know what a regatta was. Why do you not know? Because regattas are very popular in coastal cities, and they're very popular among wealthy people. So if you lived in Boston near Harvard in Cambridge, you would know what a regatta was. If you lived in Oklahoma City, you might not know what a regatta is. If you live in inner city Chicago, you might not know what a regatta is. If you live, in New Haven, Connecticut, near Yale, you might know what a regatta is. So even these questions, we could say, well, it's just an intelligence test. It's just an analogy test. Well, no, it's really almost impossible to take all of the bias out of a test. The questions will be based toward a lot of people who create the test, and they're Northeasterners. So this is a classic example. And it's not that they're trying to be biased. They just can't help it. I mean, they think everybody knows it, but we don't. Um, we can, we have found, and in fact, we've looked at that some people have said, let's look at the differences between groups, and let's not compare Caucasian versus African American. Let's just compare socioeconomic status, SES. And what they find is if we compare Caucasians and African Americans of the same socioeconomic status, the difference in intelligence goes away, because it's in a lot of ways it's not about, it's, well, in pretty much every way, the difference is not about implicitly genetics that somebody's intelligent. It's about the pot that you're in. So we need to put people in better pots. I'm not going to get political, but if somebody's being raised in a really bad pot with bad soil and bad light, they're just not going to score well on the intelligence test, and it has nothing to do with their inherent intelligence. Can intelligence improve over time? Wow, this is a crazy one. This is a researcher, I don't remember his first name, but it's called the Flynn effect. And what he found is that test scores are raising over time, that they've been rising about 25%. Why? That's so weird. It seems like we're getting dumber, but we're not. We're actually getting smarter. Why? And he said, we've had a lot more school since 1930. We're having more people go to school and stay in school, and they're becoming familiar with the tests. You are the most tested generation in the history of humankind. No joke. We're getting better nutrition. People are getting nutrition as children, and they're not getting the deficits that they would have gotten. And in fact, the wealthier people have always had good nutrition. It's a lot of the poorer people who are getting better nutrition since 1930. a more stimulating environment. I hate to say it, but in that way, we would say that television and radio and movies and all these other things have actually stimulated our brains more than back in 1930 when all we had we just stared at bags of peanuts. We have eradicated a lot of diseases, polio, malaria, things like that. So kids are staying healthier, younger, and when they're young, that's the most important time to keep them healthy. And we've just basically the higher group has stayed high, the lower group has come up because of all of these different things. So that really is the Flynn effect. All of those things have contributed to the Flynn effect. Now, that's the end of chapter 11, but we still haven't defined intelligence. We've talked a lot about it, and that's why this chapter is called Testing in Individual Differences and not Intelligence. So here is our definition. What is intelligence? After we've talked about all of this, what does it mean? And it means we can learn from experience, we can solve problems, and we can use knowledge to adapt to new situations. Now, think back to the first thing we did in this unit where we said, is this intelligence? And when we talk about computers, artificial intelligence, can a computer learn from experience? Can it solve problems and use knowledge to adapt to new situations? Maybe they're getting there. And if so, then we would say that computers are intelligent. But if not, this is, and again, look at this. This is not, do I remember things? This is, can I use what I've learned? Can I use this knowledge in a new situation? So I hope you have an expanded view of how we define intelligence and what intelligence is, and the many, many ways that we can measure and mismeasure intelligence.